sort of where we left off last time, and then plunge into the outline. Did everybody get the outline yesterday? I guess it was. I don't know if you had a chance to go over that, but we'll be. You can refer to that later. So because we're not going to have a whole lot of time today to get into as much detail as I would like, but it'll give you a good introduction to what we sent out yesterday, and then you could take a look at it afterwards. So as you recall, we talked about the state statute for 40R, talked about the purpose of the design guidelines is to produce design that's complementary to adjacent buildings and structures and consistent with the town
going in and out of
plans. We talked about what those standards can cover in terms of buildings, streets, and infrastructure, open spaces, and so on. Now, what I've realized, and I think what you see it, even the example that we emailed out, is that people go well beyond just this short list. And I haven't seen anybody at the state level object. So this is sort of a starting point. And also, a lot of these are pretty broad categories that we can fill in. My goal today is to hear as much from you as possible as to which categories you think are the most important and which need to definitely be in there and which ones maybe we shouldn't worry about. So this is the overall outline on one page, which we sent out yesterday. It sort of starts with a sort of general introduction to purpose and definitions, which sort of put the outline or put the design standards in the context of the larger 40R bylaw. There's a section at the beginning, which I'm calling guiding principles, which is basically what did we learn doing the master plan that we want to carry forward into review of any individual projects. And then it has categories for the typical major elements of design standards, so streetscape, parking, architecture, landscaping, and so on. So I'm going to go through these so we can talk about them. All of this is designed to sort of support creation of something that fulfills our comprehensive plan goals. So a lot of it is about physical relationship of different elements on the site. And one of the things that you're going to have to decide on is how much do we really want to tell people? We started talking about this last time. How much do we want to require of people in terms of locating certain uses or elements on the site? How much do we want to leave up to them to tell us with this as a guideline? So that's sort of a key question. So the guiding principles, I've got 5 of them, and I'll sort of go through those in order. The first one is that the plan, and again, these are sort of guiding principles for anyone coming forward with a plan under the 40R district bylaw. So that plan should reflect Littleton's planning goals and objectives, which is both the townwide master plan and the Littleton Station vision plan. So the board or whoever's reviewing this could refer to these plans in that review process. Does anybody have any reaction to that? Think it's a terrible idea? Okay. The second principle, which we're really trying to emphasize, is that any plan should connect to and enhance the train station and whatever facilities are associated with that train station, like the parking lot, the existing parking lot that's there. So on the sort of schematic plan diagram on the right, some of the major ways that we wanted to connect was with a continuous multi-use path that would connect, from Taylor Street all the way down Foster Street, connect to the train station, and then continue through the site and really link everything together. So that was one kind of connection. Another, obviously, is just the road system itself. So as you're circulating within the site, you can get on the interior, from the interior parts of the projects to the train station. Now you notice on the left there, that's one of the concept plans that was done previously, and it's kind of vague in terms, at best, it's kind of vague in terms of the connection between the developed area of the site and the existing train station and parking lots, right? So we would say, if they came forward with this plan under these guidelines, how are you going to connect? We wouldn't necessarily say how, but we'd say one of the principles of this idea is to have a strong connection so everyone can walk and drive directly to the train station. And then also that it's integrated with the development in a larger sense.
Should we pull over at exit 4?
Any thoughts about that? All sounds good. The third one, this is kind of a squishy one, which is about a project that would enhance Littleton's visual character and quality of life. And this is really all about the design, of course, but it's also about the function. We want it to sort of be complementary, at least in terms of architecture and other design features. We want to preserve whatever there is on the site that's worth preserving. So if there's important views, if there's any particular features that represent the character of the site. I'm not sure, there's some old orchards perhaps that are on the site, which might be incorporated into a design that would help sort of express the history of Littleton, which might be nice. And in a larger sense, we want the whole project to support Littleton's quality of life, which is a pretty broad statement. I guess you could make that apply to almost anything, but I think for me it means sort of something that doesn't take away from just, on a practical level, existing comfort and quality of life for people living on Foster Street, that it is something that the whole town could be proud of, that it's there, etc. Any thoughts about that?
That one is squishy. My first reaction is that everyone on Foster Street is going to say that traffic is part of their quality of life and is going to object to any development. So what can we do about that? I don't know.
Yeah, obviously the traffic and other sort of carrying capacity issues, you might call them, are probably going to be dealt with in other ways. Like the design guidelines is not fundamentally going to determine the amount of traffic that's appropriate on the site. That'll be part of a sort of larger review process. The fourth one is, I think for designers, this is pretty clear, but it's another one that's pretty squishy for lay people. But the idea is that the project is organized around the shared space of what we call the public realm, right? I mean, when we look at any historic town center, village center where people want to be, and often these are the ones that have a great deal of community character and a lot of monetary value as well. When you look at those places, often the architecture is sort of in the background. It's really, the architecture is creating the walls around the shared public spaces of streets, of town squares and parks, of important corridors, of like the Littleton Common. The idea is that the buildings are all something that contribute to that public realm to help make it work better and also make it coherent in terms of design. So obviously in our conceptual plan in the upper right there, we're thinking about this sort of unifying main street connection that would run all the way through the site, and things would be organized around that spine. So that's one way that the public realm organizes it. And then the different sub areas, the different development sub-districts or whatever we're going to call them, each of those is organized also around a series of separate streets, which are in turn part of the larger hierarchy of streets unifying the whole site. And then there is an open space system. Again, that idea of a continuous sort of greenway going through the site with a multi-use path, a series of small parks and squares within the project that help hold it together. So everything sort of relates to this structure, the skeleton or spine of public space. And we know from experience the successful places, either historic places or new mixed-use places, that's really what makes it work. And we'll talk more about architecture later, but one of the things we've also learned that if you have a really strong public realm, the architecture becomes less important. You spend less time arguing about the design of individual buildings because they're less important in terms of the character of the whole project.
I said that.
Any thoughts about that?
I'll jump in for a second. I really like that part with the series of open spaces and making sure that the design does include open space and connections.
All right, and then the fifth guiding principle was something we didn't talk a whole lot about during the master planning process, but it's about sustainability, right? So, and then thinking about that in the traditional sort of triad of, social, economic, and environmental sustainability sort of balanced together. So there's a lot of ways this could be expressed, as you start to see in that list. I think traditionally towns, embark on sustainability as it has to do with their public facilities and new schools being LEED certified to bring buildings up to code and make them more energy efficient, to put solar panels on the roofs and so on. And then there's sort of the larger sense of sustainability of just having a compact footprint for a project, which we know for, it's like many other investments, the more compact it is, the less energy it takes to do everything. And that has benefits for everybody forever. So if there's nothing else you can do, make it compact and walkable. And then, of course, protecting and enhancing the natural environment that's there. Does this seem like something that should be included?
Yeah, I really like that. I think that is something we kind of overlooked, and I'd like that being part of our guiding principles.
All right, so that's those are the guiding principles. You could look at them some more on that outline I sent. Is there anything that you feel like we're missing?
No?
Okay. So now I want to go through the sort of design standards, and our task, or our next task, is to give you a draft of these design standards. Now I could write that right now based on what I think should be included, which is represented by that outline. But what I need to know from you, sort of two things: any elements that you think are not appropriate to this site, and then anything that's we really want to emphasize and add. And then the other question is, which elements do we want to approach in a more general way, like streets should be designed to fit into the character of Littleton, and which ones do we want to have specific numerical or other guidelines that people could objectively check off? Because that's really the key question, is how detailed and what do you require as a specific criterion of approval, and which things do you sort of leave up to a matter of design and discussion as you go through the process?
I have a question about open space. So do the design guidelines address how the structures interact, or face, or address the open space, and or are the developers responsible for including open space within do we say that that is the case, or is that always going to be set aside by the town at the beginning, and then the developers get to build around it?
Well, I think as with any other private development, you generally would leave it to the developer to decide what remains open and what gets built. I think probably as with your existing bylaws, there's limitations on the amount of building coverage you can have on a site. And in other areas, you might require a certain amount of open space. But that's a good question. I think again, if one of your principles is to concentrate development and have it compact and walkable and efficient, you don't necessarily want to have a blanket provision of, say, you have to have 40% open space, because then you just spread everything out.
Yeah, I'm thinking one of the talking points about the Hager homestead was the people really reacted very positively to the field and the walking path through there, and the fact that it was connected to things on each side. I think that they made it feel like the whole thing fit into the neighborhood better. And so some discussion or guideline around how the open space interacts with the area as a whole, or with the individual chunks of land within it. The other thing I was just realizing was there's that open space on the other side at the two new developments on the other side of Foster Street, that it would make sense to sort of make sure we're addressing those or unifying the open space if we can.
Creating a linkage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like, there's obviously going to want to be crosswalks and stuff, but maybe there's some other, a bike. Let's build an Acton like, bike bridge. I don't know, but.
All right, well, you see, I'll talk more. That's sort of the relationship of buildings to space, to public and private. It sort of runs through everything. So I guess one key question is, in our concept plan, we sort of talk about that main spine, that main road, which logically is going to be wider and busier than the other roads. So typically what happens is you have one cross section for the main road, and then you have other cross sections for the sort of secondary and tertiary roads. And it can be very helpful in design standards to, as you see here, is to actually tell people what you want. So it's basically the width of the road, but also the way the road is organized in terms of where are the buildings, where is sort of private space in front of the buildings, what we call the private frontage, what is the public space along the street with the sidewalks and tree belts or whatever you have. And then for the street itself, how wide is it? Is there parking on one side or both sides? How many lanes, and so on. So I guess a key question for you all is, do we arrange the design standards to say we want the developer to tell us what the hierarchy of street is like, and it should include all of these elements? Here's a typical example. Or do we want to say, here is the list of streets that we want, and they should be no more than 30 feet wide with parking on both sides, or whatever it is. And then,
so we can be as prescriptive as we want to be to try to drive the directive.
Right. And then,
isn't the main, there's always like a balance between how much control we want to give up and how much we want to retain, though. Maren, so I think I would really like to hear Maren and Mark's opinions on this, because we want developers to be interested, but we want it to be, lucrative or profitable for them, but we also want to make sure that we get what we're looking for. So what's the balance there?
right. I mean, your recent experience with the Littleton Common form-based code is a good example. I mean, there you're dealing with a historic area. You're really trying to force people, this is my own observation, you can have your own opinion, you're really trying to force people to make it into more of a walkable village. And so I think, from my observation, you concluded that you have to be pretty strict as to what you want. And those buildings were described very carefully, so that there's not a whole lot of wriggle room in terms of what people are going to give you. Here you have a site which is more of a blank slate, and it's not part of a historic district. It's not
Yeah, but
all that visible. No, I'm just saying that that's the context that you have to make this decision is, do you want to specify exactly what you want and describe all those streets and exactly where the buildings are and how big they should be, or not?
I thought that's the reason we went to the 40R, so that we would give the developer more flexibility, yet we have the ultimate decision as to the look and feel of what's going to be going on up there. That was the selling feature of doing the 40R. I don't think we want to spell out how we want the buildings. They're going to be apartment buildings. They're going to be condominiums. I would think we'd have more concern about the total layout of the whole property, as to, we're trying to get a little individual village up there. So I think we'd be more concerned about that than the actual, what the buildings look like. Obviously, we don't want them to look like Red Roof Inns up there, but we do realize that it's going to be a 4-story apartment building. It's going to be 50 feet tall.
yeah, I mean, to me, I
And
think
I guess that's,
yeah, I agree with you, Mark. I think, we've been very clear about, and I think the citizens have been very clear about what we're looking for. So I think, to me, I'm looking for guidance on how do we write this so that there's flexibility for the developers, but we also retain the kind of the Littleton look. We've got a lot of open space. We have walkability. We have the ability to bicycle. So for me, I'm looking for guidance from you, Peter, on how we should write this thing.
If I could jump in here, I think I'd take the lead from Groton versus Linfield, just using the 2 examples that we had before today, because Groton was in fact less prescriptive and was more focused on the outcome, and that outcome was communicated pretty clearly, if you just look in downtown Groton, to the developers and what they apologize. It's kind of busy around here. The outcome, the desired outcome, is exactly what you're saying, Delisa. It's what the residents and all of us have said that we want. We want that walkability. We want as much open space as possible. But we also want to allow the developer to have some flexibility. So I think that if we follow the lead from Groton's bylaws, that I think that's a great starting point. It looks like the layout that you gave us, Peter, leans more that way than towards like the Linfield, where there's more numbers and it's much more prescriptive.
yeah, I agree, Chuck. I think we want them to come back to us with a concept of what the whole thing's going to look like, and then we look at it as a whole, not at the apartments over here and this over there. We see the whole package, just like you're talking about in Groton. We get the things that we want in it: the open space, the walkability, the delineation of the different areas and things like that, and the roadway and the streetscapes and all of that stuff. We get the final choice of that once they present it to us.
So, Mark, one of the things that you said, I don't remember when, a couple of weeks ago, was, we want them to put the tall buildings at the back, right? Like where they're not going to be as visible. So I guess I'm fine with letting them do being as hands-off as possible, but it probably would be wise to think of a few guidelines, things that we do want, so that they don't come and their first pass is completely wrong, and we say, oh no, you got to put the apartments over the other side of the hill.
Well, yeah, and also keep in mind that who knows when all this is going to happen, and who knows who will still be on the planning board and select board. So I think we need to make sure we don't leave too much of this open for too much interpretation.
But ultimately, the town has a pretty substantial amount of say, along with the state, whether or not the design is going to be accepted or not, and is going to be moved forward. So I think the relationship, if it's the longs that we go forward with, everything that they've expressed in conversations that I've had in walking the site and whatnot, seem to very much be they're listening. They're paying attention.
Oh, I agree.
So I
I
think
agree.
that's important to kind of set those expectations, and they know it's going to be a lot easier for them if they kind of meet us where we want to be.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, so as long as we do a good job of putting in just enough regulations to let everybody know what it is we're looking for.
Right.
So Peter, can you pull that together based on what we're saying?
Well, yes. That's the question. Yeah, I mean, I think as I indicated in the email, I think we want to be somewhere maybe a little bit more prescriptive than Groton in terms of specific numbers for things like how we want buildings to face the street, because we do have the possibility to do that. I mean, in Groton, it's somewhat easier for them to be open because there's a lot of stuff already there. And you could sort of say, we want you to fit in with the buildings on either side of you. Here, we don't have any buildings.
Right.
So we need to give them enough of a structure to say, and to be able to say at a meeting, this is why we don't like this particular design. So, but that gives me a lot more guidance that I need, I think. So,
Well, do you want to say something like the large massive buildings, wherever possible, will try to incorporate topography to minimize that? Because let's face it, the townhouses and the single family and stuff like that, that's not going to be what the real issue. The issue is going to be the big buildings. So
right.
maybe if at the very least we put in something that says wherever possible, topography will be used to mask or minimize the effects of the multi-story buildings, or something like that. That way, that'll force them to put it. Not that I think we need to force them. I don't think so. I think they want to put them on the other side of the hill so that you're only going to see 2 stories, not 4 stories. So,
Yeah, we'll talk more about
I think that
buildings.
makes perfect sense.
And frankly, it makes better economic sense for them too, because if they were going to do it further up the hill, where there's going to be a hard stop on us as far as what they can do for height. It's going to be a height restriction
Right.
that's going to limit their ability to build more units and thus make more money.
Well, they're going to be restricted to 50, according to this, 50 feet, which is a 4-story building. So, I think from an aesthetics, we'd rather see that building tucked into the 4 stories is facing 495, but 2 stories is facing everything else, so it kind of blends in. Doesn't that make more sense? That's what they've been talking
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think everybody's in agreement with that part. I'm just wondering, don't we handle that piece of it in the location of the sub-district, shall we say, the location of the 20 unit per acre part of the 40B, rather than in the design standards? We say the 40 units per acre can be this portion of the site, or up to 20 units per acre can be this portion of the site.
Yeah, it's essentially an overlay.
Yeah, I guess the question is for the mixed use area up by the street, up by Foster Street, where you're going to want to have apartments above the shops if you can. The question is, how tall can those buildings be? And so, but we're going to get to the buildings.
I didn't think we were really leaning towards that. We're not looking at a lot of retail out there. We're looking at conveniences more than a mixed use kind of area out there. Is what I was under the impression. What are you going to have? 10,000 square feet of commercials at the most, maybe a convenience store, coffee shop. So do we really want mixed use above that, or would rather push it further back into the site and keep it away from the street and away from the neighbors and have it as its own little community? I thought that's kind of what we were looking for up there.
Well, I think part of one of the ideas coming out of the master planning process was to try to get something happening around the train station. So it's not just a big asphalt parking lot surrounded by open space.
Yeah. I agree. I thought we were looking for mixed use around the train station.
Well, we can get
Yeah,
into that.
retail. Yeah,
We could get into that, or we could limit that by putting that red mixed use zone could be, it's 25-foot height requirement, or something to that effect, where, but it has to, then we can get into the architecture where it has to be, certain type of structure so that it does fit in with the rest of the residential component that is all the abutters.
Yeah, I think it's
Similar to the form-based code stuff that we did for the common.
all right. So one of the sections is talking about what we call vehicular access and parking. So this is basically guidelines for how they lay out the driveways and connections. One of the key ideas is to, if there are multiple lots, different ownership, or if it's different sections within the project, is that you ask them to connect across from one part of it to another. So whether it's one big development project or multiple lots, what tends to happen is you have an apartment building surrounded by a parking lot over here. You have a cluster of commercial over here, and you can only get there by going out on the main road. So the idea here is to require people to connect with alleys and driveways in the back so that it's easy to circulate around the whole project. So it really ties everything together. And then to include shared parking, which actually then is easier if you're connected to your parking lot, so that the empty parking lots at the train station or in a commercial area that are empty at night can be shared by the residences and vice versa. Key question here is the amount of parking. So this is your current parking requirements, 2 spaces per dwelling unit. I've highlighted or bolded the key issues. So 2 spaces per dwelling unit, 1 space per 150 square feet for retail, and then 1 space per 250 feet for office. So this, from our observation, for any kind of village development, this is probably twice as much parking as you really want to require.
Yeah, from a planning point of view, certainly I would agree with that statement.
Right. So this, it keeps everybody happy who has a car, but it tends again to, you end up having, probably under this, you'll have more paved area than you have building area, or building footprint at least. And you probably will have at least as much paved area as total square footage of buildings, which is basically a suburban model of development. So here you're trying to do transit-oriented development. You're trying to do mixed use, encourage people to not have so many cars, to walk to the station. You're trying to connect things together so people don't have to drive from one area to the other. So I would recommend no more than like 300 square feet per 1,000 square feet of buildings, or rather one parking space, or 3 parking spaces per 1,000, sorry. So 250 square feet in 1 space gives you 4 spaces per 1,000. 150 square feet is something like 6 spaces per 1,000. But if you look at sort of traditional village centers, 3 spaces per 1,000 is pretty typical. And all of that is also an incentive for developers to build more of what you want, which is places with people in them doing things. Any thoughts about that?
Peter, I'd ask you, just based upon, Lexington, Reading, Woburn, Newburyport, other communities that have done 40Rs, with similar components to them, what is kind of the standard, if you would?
That's a really good question. I don't know specifically for 40Rs as a group.
Peter, and when we did our 40R in Grafton, we actually had one space for 300 square feet. That gets close to your 3 per thousand.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty much our recommendation for village planning, village zoning in general. So. I mean, the developer.
It's pretty close to our, I think.
Go ahead.
Never mind.
All right. So I think a lot of the rest of these elements here will be matter of good practice, so not very complicated. Then we get into architecture. So a lot of possible things to talk about with architecture. We'll get to the sort of the size and the scale of buildings. Typically, sort of, I think the minimum things we want to talk about is the siting of structures relative to the other elements. I think, again, that emphasis on that concept of buildings helping to shape the public spaces, to shape the public realm, sort of be driving everything. We want the buildings to be not overscaled, not too big. But then the question is, how big is too big? But you see some of the typical diagrams on the right. The top one is sort of talking about how the building is, again, shaping the sort of pedestrian space along the street. And you have a building frontage zone. You often might want to have a maximum building setback as well as a minimum building setback so that people can't put the buildings too far from the street to make that frontage zone work. We could talk about ground floor use limitations versus uses in the upper stories, and then location of parking if they want to have parking in the buildings or adjacent to the buildings. Any thoughts about mixed use in the building and ground floor limitations? What often becomes an issue.
Other than parking, Peter, what are some other GFLs?
Well, typically,
Residential
especially in downtown or Main Street redevelopment, the zoning will require that it has to be a retail use or something that's active, and you won't allow any residential use on the ground floor. The problem, of course, is you see in Littleton and elsewhere, there's not enough retail uses to fill all that available space. So oftentimes it can take a while to lease out, or they have to sort of subsidize those leases. So what did you do with the Littleton Common zoning?
It requires retail on the first floor,
Everywhere?
except for in buildings that are behind the main buildings.
Right, so this would obviously be something that would make sense maybe within the sub-districts or the mixed-use sub-district, or to say buildings facing certain street or facing Foster Street have to have retail on the first floor, and other buildings don't have to.
Well, I'm wondering if that isn't the only way we assure that we get some commercial development there, is to require first floor to be commercial use. So that's some of what's going to unlock the economic development, the economic development potential out there.
Right, and so then the sort of lower part of this slide talks about the more detailed elements that go into making attractive sort of traditional buildings. So this is a key question for you all as well. So I think one of the reasons a lot of guidelines get into this elaborate description of facade requirements is that if you don't tell people what you want, they'll end up doing something that's sort of traditional, but doesn't quite look right. So there's been, as you know, there's an awful lot of historical looking or design buildings that don't really look historical because they've got sort of some elements, but they didn't really follow through with all of the ones that you really need to make something fit to a historical context. So that's why those are typically done. The lower element sort of talks about a number of things, but I think the key idea here is sort of transparency of building facades where they face a public space. So whether it's a public space of the street or a square or whatever, you want to have, like typically it's at least 70 or 80% of glass on that ground floor, which we know enhances the sort of liveliness and pedestrian friendliness of a public space. So you're looking in those shop front windows, you're seeing what's going on. If you're sitting inside, you're looking outside and vice versa. So all those things are part of what makes downtowns and village centers work. So in terms of architecture, when we went through the master planning process, you recall we did this visual preference survey and got these results. So there was, as you see, low support for houses of a very modern style, as shown on the right. Pretty good support for houses in a traditional style. And of course, houses are the easiest ones to manage because the developer's not trying to build something that is totally overscaled. When you get to the larger buildings, it becomes harder. So here we have sort of low support for kind of these suburban style townhouse type buildings, more urban style brick buildings, and a lot of support for buildings that sort of look like they could have been built 150 years ago, especially ones with a lot of vegetation and sort of a nice pedestrian space out front. Village center buildings, likewise, a lot of support for traditional sort of farmstead style buildings or traditional mixed-use buildings like in the center, where you have a sense of this is something that could have been there 100 years ago. It's something that's sort of evolved over time with multiple dormers and cute little windows and so on.
Peter, I'm sorry, I don't want to, excuse me for interrupting. We only have until 4 o'clock, so I think we should focus on anything that's new. I mean, I think we're all pretty familiar with what's already what we
right. Well,
survey.
Yeah, where I'm going with this is you have to make a decision about, like if we have guidelines that says the only thing we want is the stuff that got strong support, nobody's going to build it. And I put in a couple of examples here of this is the kind of thing that people are going to want to build. This is a typical kind of apartment complex in Shrewsbury, which is 3.5, 4-story buildings with parking in lots in between the buildings. The buildings lined up, fairly large massing. They did try to cut it up with some dormers and some breaks in the facade for the balconies and so on. But this is pretty typical of what a developer would probably want to build. Here's another one, a little more upper scale Avalon development in Northborough, sort of a combination of, I guess, a larger apartment with swimming pool, smaller apartments, and then townhouses. Again, probably pretty typical of what the market could support. But they're basically pretty large boxes with some nice detailing sort of pasted on. So a little porch roof on the bottom, some little hats on top. And this is 4 stories, which I think you've said would be acceptable on the site. So the question is, and there's a couple more examples on this one from the VPS, where you have 3-story buildings with kind of breaks in the facade, some changes in the facade in terms of breakouts and bump outs, different colors and so on. all of that can be incorporated in design guidelines. But the reason I brought this up again today is not that we haven't talked about it a lot, but we just need to be clear that we can't require people to build 2 or even 3-story cute little buildings on this site and expect probably much to happen.
So what do you suggest? What are you suggesting? What are you suggesting we do?
Well, I think I would be open toward, well, at least 4 stories, but require a fair amount of detailing that sort of goes beyond just putting a hat on the building, but would really involve, breaking up the facade in terms of the massing, not just colors, to integrate like roof elements into the design of the building, which this sort of does. I think this is not a bad example of a very simple apartment building, but you can see how, whoops, if you can see that, I know it's small. The break in the facade where it bumps out is actually organized within the pattern of the windows. There's that sort of separate tone across the whole upper story, which helps to sort of break it and separate it from the lower stories so it doesn't look so massive. And all of that we can incorporate into the design guidelines.
I personally would like to see that in there. What does everybody else think?
Yeah, I would totally agree on that. If anyone has been over by the Solomon Pond Mall, there's a new mixed-use development. The residential component is the Rockwell, which I think really would be a good example that is not too far for people to even see. I'll send around the link to it. I'm actually just looking at some of the photos that they have on their website, and I think the elements that Peter is talking about, they hit that as well, but also some interesting ways to sort of use of various colors, and as well as those building elements to do what Peter was talking about. That one that was the light gray or light blue that you showed, Peter, well, it had some of the physical elements. It didn't utilize materials or colors in a way to differentiate it that much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can, expand upon that to provide something that I think people would recognize a little bit more. So
Yeah, I just took a look at it. So, I think I'm in agreement. So if everybody else is, then does that give you what you need to?
Sorry.
Okay. Yes, that's helpful. I'm not sure we had ever quite confirmed that. So 4-story buildings are okay. 5-story buildings? Have you already decided that?
Well, Lauren, that area in the back where we talked, that's close to the highway, how many stories could we accommodate there without it being?
I'm comfortable with 4 not needing any additional emergency apparatus. 4 works.
Mark, what do you think?
4 is the highest we want to go.
Okay, there.
4 is the highest we want to go.
Okay, thank you.
It just gonna be that much more difficult to sell if we go any more than that, in my opinion.
I mean, Peter, I want to make sure you walk away here today with all the answers you need, because as you know, we are under a very, very tight timeline. So ask away. Tell us what you need to know.
Yeah, that's why I'm dwelling on these things. I think that this is actually a good example because it's like a big box, but what they did is they took sort of a typical sort of traditional window and they lined them up, but they're sort of lost within this big facade. And so it looks odd, right?
It's very vanilla.
It's just,
Yeah, so,
it
okay,
doesn't look good.
okay,
And
No character.
this one is a little bit better, still not perfect, but.
yeah, but much better.
So then the other question is on the sort of the mixed use on the commercial side. If we do have some commercial, sort of want to reflect a little bit on what people are actually building. I mean, this kind of thing we're seeing all over, which is kind of taking traditional frontage mall and turning it to something that's more of a lifestyle center. But it's still, you can't see it here, but there's still a big parking lot on the right. And these buildings are still basically just 1-story slabs. with a pretty
Parapets.
nicely designed facade, and then a pretty good sort of streetscape with the different elements of the trees and the planters and the benches and so on. I think obviously a better example is one that tries to emulate a traditional main street and then has a mix of uses above it. This is more of the lifestyle center approach, but pretty nicely designed. So you have sort of 3 stories. The upper story is cut up with dormers and so on. And then you have something like the Point. And I thought it would be useful to talk about this in terms of any commercial or mixed-use development on our site. Is this a positive example or a negative example in terms of what you want?
I think it's too big, but I don't
I
mind
think
the layout.
But
You what?
yeah, I mean, it's fine, you know.
I mean, I think it's interesting enough. It it works with the terrain. It it has like some places, roads that are going in different, like up and down through levels and cut throughs, and it's interesting. It's not a big grid, at least.
But I mean, the space, the area we're talking about isn't big enough to accommodate something the size of the Point. So
No, but it could certainly incorporate this much.
right.
I mean, if you had this next to the train station, I would argue that would be certainly enhance the train station in terms of having activities that would support, a few neighborhood shops and some restaurants and so on. I don't know, when you were going through this process of proving the Point, was there something that you wish the town had been able to ask for? Or any lessons that you learned about, we shouldn't let them do that?
An interesting question. I think the planning board was really very pleased with the way the developer proposed the 0 lot lines and thought outside of what our zoning would have allowed. So, and then let's bring that to the train station site, coming up with design criteria of what we want to look at is kind of jumping forward in that process. The only thing missing from the Point is a connection to walkable open space.
Right, yeah. It's one of the key issues is it's sort of an isolated, sort of traditional shopping center development, right? Even if it's nicely designed,
The
sort
other
of
thing
isolated.
it would be nice if there was like a trail, like an area where people could ride their bike in. So it's just sidewalks.
Right.
But I mean, obviously, it's a destination. Like you can't walk there.
Right.
You have to drive there and park. And I assume that we are talking about trying to develop something so that the people living nearby can walk to this area. Like that's obviously making it less car centric would be great.
Yes, and more bicycle and pedestrian friendly. So I think that's one thing that I wish we had looked at for the Point.
But aren't we also looking at the fact that we have Crosstown Connect right there, that eventually we're going to be able to offer some sort of shuttle service through town that will ask people to take the shuttle rather than drive to this property? Isn't that something we should be looking for closer to the future than in the distant future?
I think that helps, but I just don't think that replaces being able to walk out your door and on a nice day and just walk there. You have to plan for schedules and, get on the bus and get off the bus with a bunch of people who are smelling, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that would also dovetail with what the Transportation Advisory Council is looking for, and just in general what people are looking for. They want to be able to bike and walk, and eventually, wouldn't it be great if we could connect the Point up with the train station? It's not that far.
Right.
Are you proposing a tunnel?
Put a zip line.
Now, it's sort of related to all of this is sort of concept of what is good architecture, especially where you have a site which is similar to the point, which doesn't really have a context, right? So what do you ask for? I mean, one of the problems with looking for traditional buildings form and design when people are building 4-story, 100-foot long apartments is that that's not a traditional use, right? It's not a traditional building form. And if you do try to make it a traditional, it ends up looking more like a mill, right? So typically the response is you break that up into smaller masses and you make it look more like a collection of smaller buildings that were put together. This is from the Groton guidelines, and we spent a lot of time there talking about this idea of authenticity as opposed to historically accurate buildings. So how do you make a building that, even if it's not something that would have been built in Littleton 150 years ago, that it still looks like something that's honestly built, where you can understand the construction, that it looks like it was put together from sort of recognizable parts that have a human scale and so on. And that's all sort of this idea of authenticity. So instead of everything being covered in plastic materials, it's made out of traditional materials. So even if it's a new kind of a form, as these ones sort of attempt to show, it's something that's recognizably of the region, perhaps. This is one in Reading, Massachusetts, which is a fairly recent building, a downtown infill project. And it's sort of interesting because it's a very contemporary looking design, right? But it's traditional materials, it's sort of brick and that sort of buff colored stone looking thing. Sort of traditional proportions for the windows, but the windows themselves are actually very contemporary in terms of the design. But it has a lot of reference to traditional proportions in terms of the vertical repetition of the windows and the doors. It respects the street and has sort of a traditional sort of shop front appearance. As you see, a lot of glass along the street. It's got a covered arcade, I think, so you can walk under at least part of it. It's got clear entrances, and the massing is broken up, as you see in the aerial, into a number of smaller masses, especially facing the street. So it looks like a collection of traditional buildings, even though it's a new building. So it sort of demonstrates, I think, that idea of a kind of authentic building that's not necessarily a recreation of a historic building.
And that was an existing downtown area that they slapped that on top of it. They're
Right.
very densely populated. It does slope to the back. If you
Right.
look at that
So
top left picture, it slopes downhill towards the train station, towards the train tracks. And so
Right.
it's pretty impressive when we get a chance to look at it.
So this is a 4-story building, but one of the things they did to make it look less imposing is that the top story is set back. There's like a little balcony area. So that sort of does two things. It makes the building a little more interesting. It breaks up the facade, but it also sort of humanizes it. Because
So
when
how
you
do
see
we-
that, it's like you
Peter,
put yourself on that balcony.
Peter, how do we get this, what we're looking for here? Again, I think hopefully we've given you a clear idea of what we're looking for, and you can write this up.
Dave Ketchum.
Well, the reason I'm showing this and asking the other questions is I'm trying to get a clear idea of what you're looking for. So would this be an acceptable thing, even though it's not a historical building?
I think it's too contemporary personally. I think something more along the lines of the Rockwell or the Paddock in Boxborough, which are much more rustic or bucolic looking, especially across the street from the old Durkee Farm.
Yeah, I think
It's all
I agree
colonial
with
homes.
I think we're looking for more of the traditional farm style.
Colonial, yeah.
I don't know. I think you could probably, with some detailed changes, make something like this work. I do like the form of it. I think the form of it is right. Like, not necessarily the block, but the setbacks and the top floor being, as you say, it humanizes it. I think that's important. And also the colonnade in the front, that's very much like a sort of inviting place to come into the building, and it's like an interface between the environment.
I think more so, like if we were doing that on the street, and we were trying to get that mixed use on the street.
Yeah.
And we were trying to get the housing on the street. That would work, or maybe somewhere on the common. If someone buys Bank of America and a couple of other buildings adjacent to it, maybe this is something along these lines would work there. But I don't think for this project, it's great for what they did in Reading, because all of that retail, most of it was pre-existing, and they were able to just make it work and shoehorn it in there, really. But I just don't think it fits Littleton, for starters. But I just don't think it fits that location either. I mean, you're right, Matthew. I think that we could gussy it up some to make it look more colonial or Littleton-esque. But
Yeah, see, I'm kind of in agreement with, well, actually with both of you, because the fact is that if you could make the facade look more colonial, but I do like how there are apartments on top. I like how it's set back. I like the balconies. So I think you can have both.
You just don't like the surface of it. I mean, you like the
Personally,
ideas
Matthew,
embodied in it. You just don't like the way.
For me,
Yeah.
I love this, but this is much more my style. But given what residents have said,
Fair enough.
I agree with what Chuck has said.
That's actually a good point. When you look at the stuff that they reacted to in the station survey, it's very much not this, right?
Right.
Yeah. No, I'm very clear on what the residents want, but as the key here, which I hope you're understanding, is that we have to balance that with what the developers can actually build. So by the time you build a 65-foot wide by 100-foot long 4-story apartment, it's really hard to make that look like a traditional New England building. That's the fundamental issue. So you can either try to break up the facade and put a little colonial hat on it. You can really break up the facade, but the trouble is that's really expensive in terms of making it multiple masses. But I wanted to show this because it's sort of rethinking that whole idea and saying, well, let's not try to make something that looks like a 19th century barn, but let's make something that works really well. That's maybe a more contemporary form. So it's very helpful to hear your reactions to this, and I think I understand sort of where we're going.
Another good example, if I could just throw it out there, I can't think of the name of it, and I'm just racking my brain trying to think of it. It's in Concord, right by the Shobabrook Bakery. Myron, do you know what I'm talking about? They do have like Orange Theory is on the ground floor, and they've got a couple of maybe a real estate office on the ground floor, but it's somewhat, until you see you muted, but they do have it's more of a contemporary look, but it's behind downtown West Concord, and it's really a cool property. Again, for my own aesthetic, I like this a lot, but I just don't think that based upon what the residents have said they're looking for, this is what we should be delivering.
Yeah, that one in Concord is a nice building, but it sort of fits that context pretty well too. It's sort of behind the main street. So that's the hard part. The other, we're almost done with this. The other elements, I think I know pretty much what they need to say. So the landscaping standards basically talking about having ample, attractive shade tree plantings to help ameliorate the parking lots, to have enough shade trees in the streetscapes to provide continuous canopy, to require a certain amount of attractive landscaping around the different buildings, and then to create some standards for buffer plantings where we need to screen the neighbors. Does anybody have any comment on that, or things you think should be added?
I think there's a lot pre-existing, so I think we should work with as much of the mature growth that's already there as possible, as well as the topography. There are a lot of, you mentioned that there were orchards back there. Keith Carroll's, the house that Keith Carroll occupies right at the driveway of Life Care Center to the left-hand side. That was the home of the orchardist, and as much of that as we can retain, I think will definitely provide the most mature and the best looking screening possible, but certainly we want to do as much as possible to screen this to, make it blend in as much as it keep saying as much as possible. But I just think work with what we've got and have the developer work with what they've got rather than just bulldozing the whole site and then putting in 15-foot trees that are going to be replaced in another 10 years because they didn't survive.
Yeah, and they're also, Maren, what's the name of the group that's coming up with recommended trees and plantings using a lot of native?
The shade tree committee?
No, it's not. I'm on the committee and I just can't think of the name of it. Maren, what am I talking about here?
I don't remember the name of the subcommittee either.
Yeah.
They are coming up
Littleton
with
Gardeners?
No. It's anyways, but we should get it written in that they have to look at that.
Yeah.
So, Maren, you and I can talk about that. I just off the top of my head, they've done a lot of work and it's really, really good information, both for commercial developments as well as residents.
Yeah, that would be a great thing to reference. All right, lighting. This again is, I think I know what the best practices are that we want to put in there. Again, as you see in the lower typical diagram, it's trying to have lights that are appropriate to the different parts of the project. So if you have pedestrian areas, you have lights that are scaled to pedestrian. If you have parking lots, you have lights that do what they need to do but aren't ugly. All the lights are sort of downward shining cutoff fixtures, etc.
I think it's pretty much common sense here. Just making sure that the residents that are currently there are not impacted negatively by light pollution.
Right. Has this come up a lot in town before? Is there any big initiative to do dark skies?
Yeah, actually, that I would love to be able to make that recommendation that we have dark sky compliant lighting on the site.
I agree.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've realized is that we spent years getting people to do cutoff fixtures that wouldn't be in your eyes, but didn't worry enough about the overall level of light. And the thing is that the light, even if it's cut off, it goes down and it bounces off the pavement. And suddenly you'll say, well, we ordered cutoff fixtures for this project, but still you look over the hill and there's this glow at night because all that light is bouncing. So it's sort of important to control the overall level of light, to have as much as possible on timers, and then of course to make it cut off. And that's all part of the dark sky standards. So if you're comfortable with that.
Guys, I apologize, but I'm gonna have to jump off. But thank you very much, Peter, and thanks everybody.
Okay.
Thanks,
come up, shoot me a text or something. If something comes up and you need me to jump back on, I'll dial in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Right.
Okay.
So signage again is pretty straightforward. I think I know what to suggest in terms of signs that, basically what this is about is making signs that work as well for pedestrians as they do for people in cars, to really focus on signs that are visible from the pedestrian ways, to make it easy to find places, but not make those signs something that hits you in the face. And that which also have signage that's integrated into the architecture. So whether it's a traditional sign or a more modern sign, it's something that's part of the overall scheme for the building. Any thoughts or concerns about signage? Okay. Well, gosh, that's the end of the show. Sorry, I don't have more. Joe, you've been pretty quiet. What based on sort of your experience in Grafton and elsewhere, what would you really recommend for these guidelines overall? Any advice?
And I think you hit, all the points. I mean, I think the main thing is that, there's a lot of thoughts from Littleton's perspective as far as making sure that there's a connection between, say, a agricultural open space past or aesthetic with the built environment, and seeing hints of Littleton's development in buildings. And I think that there are some examples out there around that could be utilized. I think you've hit all those points. There's a couple things that Mara and I probably need to just touch base with maybe Chris Stoddard on is, regarding complete streets, some of the improvements that we're identifying, how we then connect things into this development. Do you identify not where roads go, but identify a hierarchy of streets and what needs to be there, so that street you showed the profile of, if it's the main entranceway, you need to comply with complete streets, and then after, then it can be shared. To what extent do we want to encourage the use of bicycles, and making sure that there's accommodations, whether it's a separate lane or almost a separate bikeway to connect down to the train station, and thinking about those connections outside the site.
Yeah, I think that'd be a great conversation to have, and we'd probably want to include Amy Green in that conversation, because there's literally one location for a wetland crossing at the 245 Foster Street site, and we just have to make sure we're not requiring a design that couldn't be permitted.
I think one of the other things is thinking about the structure. Identifying things that are common points within design guidelines, and then what would be then, say, things unique to this portion of the site, and as we expand to other sub-districts, so we're just not cutting and pasting and repeating things. Is there a structure that can be utilized, and then with each sub-district there's additional things, sort of like when you're shopping for a car? Well, I'm not doing the sport, I'm going for the premium, and everything that's here on the sport is included, but there's these extra things. Just giving a thought to how we know we'll have additional sub-districts in the area, but just how that gets structured for easy amendments in the future.
Yeah, I don't see these really being different for like the Foster and Taylor Street node. It's pretty much the same ideas. But it might be that the density or the dimensional standards change a little for those.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be you have like a different sub-district map and perhaps different allowances in the tables for those sub-districts. So, but yeah, let's talk about that separately. So that's all very helpful. I think I was asking about the things that I'm curious about, where we have to make the decisions. And then the other things I think are pretty much a matter of best practices, and I know what to do with those. And you all agree with the earlier suggestion that we lean more toward the sort of Groton style, which is more about describing the outcome you want, but not stipulating every sort of little element.
So next steps, timeline.
Next steps is, I think our contract calls for giving you a draft, and then we talk about that, and then we have some kind of a public meeting about that to let people weigh in. And then, Laura, we need to talk about sort of long-term schedule and when we need to finish this up. So are you in the office tomorrow, Maren?
Monday'd be better for me.
Monday would be good. So let's touch base then. Do you have another meeting scheduled this month, next month? Or is this ad hoc?
Yeah.
As needed, yeah. So how quickly do you think you can have a draft finished and ready for review?
What year is it? I'm sort of inclined not to beat it to death with detail, but to show you a draft that's mostly there. So maybe a couple of weeks. I'm looking at the calendar. Do you, I don't know what your schedules are around the holidays, but probably the week of the 21st could have something.
What's everybody's schedule?
That's-
Anybody going out of town?
Nope.
And if you are you going to confess?
It looks like there's a select board meeting Monday, 21st.
Correct.
So do you want to shoot for Tuesday that week?
I could do the 22nd. How about everybody else?
I can do it.
Joe
Yep. Sounds good.
and Mark, are you still there?
I don't see him.
No? Okay.
Did Cindy's been asking me about coming to one of these? Has she talked to you, Delisa?
Nope. I know she's made several inquiries, but I mean, she's always welcome to call in.
Yeah, I think she felt like 2:30 was tough for her at work.
Oh,
And she was wondering if maybe that's why Chuck hasn't been able to make it as well.
no, Chuck hasn't been able to make it because of family issues.
Okay.
So, so once we have the draft. Oh yeah, okay. So anyways, yeah, so we're talking about time.
I mean, yeah, the daytime's fine with me.
It's fine with me.
Okay, great. Should I shoot for 2:30 or 3 again?
That's good.
Sure. Yeah, again, it'll probably be a combination of things that are well thought out, ready to go, and then some areas where we're drilling down to, have we really made a decision about this? So I think it's good to keep that going. And so it'll be what it is. And we'll move forward.
Okay, so 2:30 then on the 22nd. Maureen, you'll send out something. Okay, great. Thank you, Peter.
All right. Am I leaving you to talk more on your own, or?
Yeah, we have some other agenda items we need to cover.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have our next meeting set up. Has everybody had a chance to review the meeting minutes? Last meeting minutes? Any changes, comments? They were fine with me. We okay to approve them?
Yes.
Okay. All in favor, say aye. Do we need to be that official on this committee one? No? Okay, good. They're approved. Affordable housing. I know that was one on the agenda, discussing that. Maureen, do you want to kind of take the lead on that?
Well, I was actually going to wonder if either Matt or Mark wanted to take that because they're members of the Affordable Housing Trust.
The last meeting we had, we went over the report from, I can't remember her name now, from the municipal.
Nancy Flynn Barvik from Metro West Collaborative Development.
Yeah, and I think we sort of we discussed like, well, what does it mean for the Affordable Housing Trust? Like, what does it mean that we want to do? And we came up with a couple of goals. I think one was, try to find a way to improve the rental situation. And Mark and I, I was coming back here saying that we should really bring the station committee into it, because what we build there is going to be some of the inventory that is going to like solve some of these problems. And if the Affordable Housing Trust thinks that we need single family versus, two bedroom versus townhouses or whatever, that should be part of the design guidelines, or at least the, I don't know what, maybe it's part of the design guidelines. So I don't think that we've really identified firm goals as far as like, we need this % more rental units. We need, 300, single room houses. And I'm not actually really sure we're going to that. I'm not sure that group is necessarily headed towards coming up with specific recommendations on what Littleton needs, as much as just knowing that there's a big need. So it might be better for us to look at that report as well and decide amongst ourselves, do we want to push the 40R in some direction, like more or less apartments, more or less rental units, and so forth.
Lauren, what do you think?
Let's see, the report seemed to point, as Matt said, that to the need for affordable units for seniors and for 20-somethings. There is a wide range of housing need for both rental units and small housing units, 1 and 2 bedroom units, both rental and ownership. On the affordability side of it, you can require 80%, up to 20% of the housing units in a 40R are required to be affordable units. The town can consider requiring more in our 40R district, but we'd have to make sure we understand what that means for, will anything actually get built? And anything that provides deeper affordability than 80% AMI requires some sort of additional funding. It's hard for a development to include anything more affordable than 80% AMI, but there are options, like from attracting a nonprofit developer for a portion of the site, to grants, to low-income tax credits. Those are the kind of things that some developers are able to attract to a development.
So is there anything we need to put in our recommendation, or will it just kind of fall out of the 40R? Will we accomplish what we're looking for just using the 40R zoning? Or do we need to beef it up?
I think once we're a little further into the process, that's a good question to ask, make sure we're on target. But so far, I think we are.
Okay.
So you're saying the regular 40R application, state guidelines, et cetera, are going to let us determine some of that mix, rental versus ownership, how much affordables, and so forth?
Yes, at different points. In the bylaw itself, you'll have to stipulate what percentage of affordable units you'll require within the district. I think the market will be the one to dictate the rental units versus ownership units. If the town is trying to dictate that, then we'll have to write that in.
Do we want to get into dictating that, or do we want to let it be up to the market?
I mean, I think the market in some respects has failed so far, like based on that report. I mean, clearly our, median house price is climbing. It's over, what did it go up to 480 something this year and then tax classification? I think it would probably, the Affordable Housing Trust from that, I don't know, how do I say that? From the Affordable Housing Trust point of view, forcing, if you want to use that word, a way to get more inexpensive options in Littleton is a good goal. And if we just leave it up to the market, I think we're going to end up with like expensive, single family homes and townhouses or garden style apartments.
I mean, one of the things when we're talking about, especially for this first district, if we're saying that this is going to be multifamily, especially at 20 units per acre, the market essentially is going to identify that this is going to be a rental project. Unless we come in and we identify sub-districts that then are the single family or the medium density, which then would be some condos. The condos could go either way. Mm-hmm. I think as we look at this first phase, this first sub-district that realistically is going to be higher density and therefore be rental, we don't have to really worry about identifying whether or not it's going to be ownership or rental. We're not in New York City where 60-floor building could actually be an ownership situation. I think the challenge will be when we look at the site and specifically the Long's property, is that something that we want to identify a sub-district that then has a lower density? I think that's one of the challenges in that we almost should be, looking at Peter's maps again to say, here's over here where we wanted the higher density, calculate that amount, because DHCD is going to have to calculate what they recognize as the development potential for sort of a bare minimum of units. And then say this area over here ends up being more condos, that comes in at 12 units per acre. And within the 40R bylaw, we could allow some sort of swap or a gray line to come or move if we felt that it was necessary, or going back for actually rezoning. But that's going to be, I think, one of the challenges as we look at both the bylaw itself and then the design guidelines. Some of the stuff as far as mixture of bedroom types, we'd have that in the bylaw, and at least some process that the planning board as the permit granting authority can then allow for some refinement of mix. But DHCD's typical bedroom mix is probably what you'd be looking at someone coming in with.
Okay. That's good info. Thank you.
Yeah, and Joe, I'm glad you referred to Peter's sketch about the different areas, because we do have the opportunity to say, this is the area where we'd prefer apartments, and this is the area we'd prefer townhouse style that would tend to be ownership, or might tend to be more ownership.
And I would, to go back to the questions that he was asking us, I think it's important to segregate the big apartment buildings to a specific area. And I think it's important to have design guidelines that minimize their brickness, because I think, the least expensive thing to build is a giant shoebox, and those are really not aesthetically pleasing to me.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, so I think we're all on the same wavelength then. Hold on a second. Sorry, I was getting a call. So Peter will present us with the draft in a couple weeks. We'll review that. Then, Lauren, what happens? At what point, you and I were talking, does it go to the planning board? And does do we first get the public input before it goes to the planning board or once it goes to the planning board?
I would recommend that planning board will probably have a meeting early in January. Just make it available to the board members at that time and see if there's any interest in a discussion. And then probably public outreach middle to end of January for
Okay.
that. And I
Does
would guess that'll be combined.
does the committee do the public outreach or does the planning board? Under which auspice is it?
What's the difference?
Well,
You and I are doing it.
yeah, no, I'm just trying to again understand kind of the process.
Yeah. The town is doing the outreach. Come to the meeting.
Okay, all right. So our goal is to read the draft, give that to, then Peter will go back and then sometime early January, he'll have the final report.
Peter and I are going to cuddle about when we should have I wouldn't consider it final until after we get the public input.
Okay,
For updates at that point.
okay.
But
Now, we know that the Longs would very much, are eager to get to proceed. Is there any value in talking to them before we get public input, or should it just be part of that, or just informal conversation?
I think Cindy has spoken to them already on that front, and I think that's one of the reasons she wants to join this and talk to us about it.
Well,
Mark's in communication with them too, and they've known about every one of our meetings.
yeah. So no, Matthew, yeah.
Them again today.
Cindy has been in communication with me about that, and I think there's so Mark is talking to the Longs, so I think we're covered there.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I think if there are starting to have some conversations, it may be good to Amar for Mark and Cindy for us to reach out to them to say, maybe the two of us, maybe can have a sit down with the two of them as well as Longs, just to identify, from their perspective, one, what they think a process could look like, but then two, where are they and have they started to look at some of the infrastructure needs that we may need to be aware of as we go forward with the 40R. And then quite frankly, also as we go forward with contemplating not only physical improvements as we're going into the FY22 budget, but then also grant opportunities that then we'd be able to then partner with. Knowing a long leadway at least can prepare us as we're pulling together things rather than trying to pull together a MassWorks grant application in 30 days, which just is not possible. So.
Right. So the town does have tools other than just the zoning process. The town might be able to partner on a grant application for water supply or sewage treatment, whether they need, well, sewer is going to be a need out there.
Yeah, but also remember, once we approve the 40R, we do get that initial payment based on the number of units that are permitted by the bylaw. And it's all things that then we can utilize. Maybe we need that for supporting the project for one thing or another, but just having a longer lead time just helps us out, and that those dialogues would be very helpful to be plugged into.
Yeah, I was going to say it a little different way. Having staff understand what's going on with the dialogues would be very helpful. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you guys are going to reach out to the Longs and have some conversation. Okay. Anything else we need to cover today? Or I know we're 5 minutes over, so. Everybody good? Okay. Mara and I will see you tonight.
Yes, hours.
All right. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Bye.